Hey, what's up, DBU? So today we're gonna look at the properties of water. Water is essential for life. Many of you guys know that when astronomers are looking for planets in the universe that can sustain life, they look for water, whether or not those planets have water. And if they do, scientists get super excited about it. I'm actually not even sure if they have found one with water, but if they ever did, that would be awesome. That would mean that there is potential for life because we know that water is essential for life. So, to understand water, we're going to talk about atoms. We're going to talk about how atoms can interact with each other to form molecules. Um, and that'll help us understand the properties of water, what gives water its unique properties. And it'll also set us up for Tuesday's lecture where we're going to look at organic molecules like DNA and proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. All right, so let's start with atoms. All living things, and all of matter for that fact, is made up of atoms. So all things you touch, all things even things you can't touch like air, are composed of atoms. And so atoms make up life, right? Living things are made up of atoms. And life itself is an emergent property. Remember, an emergent property is um, a property, in this case life, which results from the interaction of smaller components. So life is a property that you only find at a certain level. So you start with atoms, and those interact to form molecules, and those molecules can interact to form larger structures that can ultimately make up a cell, that ultimately compose a cell. So remember, the cell is the fundamental unit of life. So this, the smallest you can be and be a living thing, is a cell. So this paramecium here, this cell, is made up of ultimately of atoms. So let's understand what atoms are. An atom has a nucleus composed of positively charged protons and uncharged neutrons. So in the example below, you can see that that nucleus there blown up is made up of protons and neutrons, and around that nucleus is an electron cloud. And the electron cloud is composed of negatively charged electrons, which whiz around the nucleus, and they have this charge that form this cloud of energy. So it's not just that they're these little discrete particles, which you can pinpoint in the atom. They're moving so fast they form like this nebulous cloud. So here's a kicker. We just learned that, and so far science has shown that all matter is composed of atoms. And we know that atoms are mostly empty space. So you have the nucleus, which is a core of particles, and then you have electrons, but those electrons are actually, say in the last atom we looked at, you only have 6 electrons flying around, but they, between the outermost electron and the inside of the nucleus, is mostly empty space. So therefore, does that mean that matter is mostly empty space? That's weird, right? That's crazy. So it's as if the Dallas Stadium here in Arlington, the Cowboys Stadium, consider that an atom, and so the outside of that stadium would be that last electron that's flying around the nucleus, and the nucleus would be a golf ball inside that stadium, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here. It's like mostly empty space. So it's just crazy. It's one of those things that we don't understand really well. How can atoms that are made up of mostly empty space make up solid things like you and I, right? You're not made up of mostly empty space. You're solid. And the thought is that it has to do with the energy from the electrons. They form these electron clouds, and so it's still mostly empty space, but there's energy there, and that can make up matter. All right, so atoms that have different number of protons and electrons have different unique properties. So these are emergent properties. You have protons, which are just positively charged particles, electrons, which are negatively charged. You also have neutrons that are neutral. And depending on how many protons and electrons you have different properties, right? Unique properties that you don't find in protons alone or electrons alone. So you can look at this periodic table here, and you have all these different these different elements on this table are really just different combinations of protons and electrons in an atom. So an element is a substance whose properties are determined by its atomic structure, its protons and its electrons. The reason these elements behave differently is because they have different number of protons and electrons. But the properties of an element are largely dependent on its electrons and how those electrons are arranged in this electron cloud. And we'll look at that in a little bit. All right, so the most common elements on Earth are the blue ones on this periodic table. You have CHOMPs, which is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And you also have, starting with Na, you have sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and chlorine. So these are the most common elements that we find on our Earth, on our living Earth, not in the universe. The universe, if I'm not mistaken, the most common elements are helium and hydrogen. Now, 96% of your body weight is made up of CHON, the dark blue elements on this periodic table. So you are mostly made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And actually, most living things are made up of these elements. And matter that's mostly made up of these we call organic matter, and we're going to learn about that on Tuesday a little more. Now, the different unique properties of each element, of the elements, are determined by the unique arrangement of electrons in their electron clouds. So for example, here you have an oxygen atom, and so you have the nucleus in the center. It has 8 protons, and you have 8 electrons that are whizzing around the nucleus in this electron cloud. All right, if you compare that to carbon, carbon atom has 6 protons in the nucleus, and it has 6 electrons flying around. Now, obviously, you have different number of electrons, and these electrons are arranged differently in the atom. They're arranged in something called electron shells, which we'll look at in a second. But this different arrangement gives these two atoms different properties, and that's the case with every atom on the periodic table. Now, when an atom gains or loses an electron, we call that an ion. And we'll talk about ions throughout the semester, so let's make sure we know what we're talking about here. So after you lose an electron or you gain one, that atom now has an electrical charge. Normally, atoms don't have an electrical charge. They're neutral. So for example, if you look at this hydrogen ion here, it has 1 proton and 1 electron. And obviously, those kind of cancel each other out, so it's neutral. But now say that this hydrogen atom loses an electron. Now you're just left with 1 positively charged proton. So this hydrogen ion has a positive charge. And as you can see here, a hydrogen ion is just a proton. So whenever we talk about protons in this class, we're really just talking about hydrogen ions. Okay, when we look at the periodic table here, you can see that it's arranged by number. So you start with 1 up top with hydrogen, and you go from left to right, top to bottom, 1 through, I think there's 110 elements on this periodic table. Right, so this is an abbreviated table that we're looking at here. So this number is the atomic number, and that's simply referring to the number of protons in the element. So we just looked at hydrogen. Hydrogen has 1 proton, so it is first on the list. Helium has 2, and so on and so forth. Carbon has 6. So here we're looking at the element symbol of carbon, and you can see the atomic number is 6, has 6 protons, and the atomic weight is the sum of all of the masses in an element. So typically the protons and the neutrons, because they're the heaviest. Electrons are so small they don't add that much to the atomic weight. So for carbon, you have 6 protons, Your atomic weight, if you sum up all of the protons and neutrons in this atom, is 12.012. So if you subtract the atomic number from the atomic weight, you're going to get the number of neutrons, right? Because well, I haven't told you this actually. One proton is equal to one atomic weight unit. So this carbon atom has 12 atomic weight units. 6 of those come from protons. The other 6 must come from neutrons. Okay? We'll do an example in a second for you to put that into practice. All right, so what element is this that we looked at the beginning of the lecture? It has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. All right, you find it on, we just talked about it, find it on the periodic table, number 6, it's carbon. Now, let's look at nitrogen. So here you have the chemical symbol, the periodic table symbol for nitrogen, and you can see that the atomic weight of nitrogen at the bottom is very near 14. Just using this little periodic table symbol, how many neutrons does the average nitrogen have? All right, so you know that nitrogen has an atomic weight of 14. You know that it has 7 protons. So 7 of the 14 units in the atomic weight come from protons. Subtract 7 from 14 and you're left with 7 neutrons. So the right answer here would be 7. Right? Subtract the atomic number from the atomic mass. All right, so now let's transition into molecules and chemical bonds. Molecules are 2 or more atoms held together in a stable association. So once you get 2 atoms together, that's a molecule. O2, oxygen, that's the oxygen we breathe. That oxygen is 2 oxygen atoms bound together, so it's a molecule of oxygen. Now compounds are molecules containing more than one type of element. So CO2 is a compound, H2O is a compound because they are composed of 2 different elements, more than one type of element. So these atoms here, these different elements represented by the different colors, are going to come together and interact to form molecules. And this is a way of diagramming molecules. So what you're looking at, each kink on the chain is a carbon molecule, and they're bonded, the carbons, so the carbon is in each of the kinks, and they're bonded to different elements like oxygen there, the O, and the phosphorus, they're in the pink phosphate group. And so these atoms in this large molecule are held together by chemical bonds. So which molecule on this list is a molecule rather than an element? Water, right? Because you know oxygen, iron, and nitrogen are elements on the periodic table, but water is not. Water is a molecule. It's a molecule composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. So there on the left figure you see the oxygen atom in red, the 2 hydrogens in white, and the 2 hydrogen atoms are bonded to the oxygen, symbolized by that bar. So let's talk about chemical bonds. Chemical bonds depend on the atom's electron configuration. Again, what you should be picking up on is that electrons are really important, right? So the electron shells refer to the energy levels of electrons. So in this diagram here of an oxygen atom, each of the rings around the nucleus is an electron shell. And the electrons that are furthest away from the nucleus are going to be the most energetic. They're going to have the highest, highest energy level. And they're the electrons that are going to participate in the chemical bonding reactions that we're going to learn about. So in this oxygen atom, you can see that there's 2 energy shells, 2 electron shells. And the first shell holds 2 electrons. That's true for every atom. The second and third shells can hold up to 8 electrons each. So most atoms will want to have that outermost shell filled. Actually, they want all of their electron shells filled. it's just more stable that way. And so if you look at the oxygen atom here, if you count the number of electrons on the outer ring, on the second ring there, you'll see that it has 6 electrons. So it's actually missing 2 electrons to make 8, to where it can be stable. So it's going to want to grab 2 electrons from somewhere. If you look at carbon, you can see that also the inner shell has 2 electrons, the outer shell has 4 electrons. So it's going to need 4 more electrons to fill that outer shell, so it can have 8, right, to complete that 8. So that carbon is going to want to form 4 bonds with other atoms in order to fill that outermost shell. So again, atoms prefer to have their outermost shell full, and this outermost shell is called a valence shell. If this is full, if it has 8 electrons, that atom will not form bonds with other atoms. It's going to be very stable. If it's not full, however, like oxygen or carbon that we just looked at, that atom is going to form chemical bonds in order to fill that valence shell. And this is why chemical reactions happen. So let's look at what happens when you put sodium and chlorine close together. So if you look at sodium has 3 shells, right? 3 electron shells, or energy levels might be easier for some of you. But you can see that in that outermost shell, it only has 1 electron, right? And what sodium wants, just like any atom, is to have 8 electrons on its outermost shell. So it can either gain 7 electrons or give away that 1 electron, so that then the next highest shell is going to have 8. All right, and chlorine has 7 electrons on the outermost shell, if you count them. So it just needs 1 electron to complete the 8 and become stable. So if you put chlorine and sodium away, sodium would much rather give away that lone electron than have to gain 7 electrons. That's a lot of work. So it just gives and actually in chlorine only needs to gain 1 electron in order to complete it. So sodium is going to donate its electron to chlorine, and this is going to result in formation of ions. Remember, an ion is when you gain or lose an electron. So sodium lost an electron. It lost 1 negative charge, so now it has an overall positive charge. Chlorine gained an electron, so now it has 1 more negative charge, so it's overall negative charge. And this is a chemical reaction, right? It happens because atoms are trying to fill that outermost shell. All right, so let's look at 2 main types of chemical bonds. We have covalent bonds, in which 2 atoms that are interacting, that are bonding, share electrons. So here are 2 examples of simple diagrams of molecules. You have methane, which is 1 carbon bonded to 4 hydrogens, and ethylene, which are 2 carbons that are double bonded to each other, and then each of those carbons are bonded to 2 hydrogens. All right, so a single bond is when only 1 pair of electrons is shared. So here this carbon in methane is sharing 1 pair, so 2 electrons, with each hydrogen, and that's a single bond. In ethylene, you can see also that carbon and hydrogen are forming single bonds, but it just so happens that these 2 carbons are sharing 2 pairs of electrons, so that's a double bond. And a double bond is just going to be harder to break than a single bond, right? You put 2 sticks together, it makes it hard to break. You can also form triple bonds, put 3 sticks together, hard to break. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. Now, ionic bonds are when electrons are transferred between atoms and the resulting ions that are going to be oppositely charged attract each other. And we just saw an example of that. That's what happens when you put sodium and chlorine together. These interact via an ionic bond, and you form sodium chloride, NaCl, which is table salt. That's what we use to flavor our food. Table salt is just a crystal of a bunch of these sodium and chlorine ions that are attracting each other because of their opposite charges. All right, so let's recap real quick. What type of bond occurs when electrons are transferred between atoms? covalent bonds, hydrogen bonds, ionic bonds, or double bonds. All right, we haven't talked about hydrogen bonds yet, so you can rule that one out. It's not covalent bonds because covalent bonds share electrons between two atoms, right? Covalent bonds aren't formed when you transfer electrons. Covalent bonds are formed when you share them. Let's look at double bonds. Double bonds actually are a type of covalent bond. You can have single bonds or double bonds, so that's not it. So the right answer is C, ionic bonds, which we just looked at, sodium chloride. That's when an electron is actually transferred to another atom and then the opposite charges attract. Okay, so now that we know what atoms are, how atoms interact to form molecules, the different kinds of chemical bonds that exist, let's look at the properties of water. So water is a polar molecule. That means that each end, or pole, hence the name polar, has slight opposite charges. So you can see here that oxygen has a slight negative charge, and the slight negative charge is symbolized by the Greek letter sigma there. Sigma negative has a slight negative charge on that end. And then the two hydrogens have slight positive charges. Why does this happen? So oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen, which means that it's more electron hungry. It attracts electrons more strongly than hydrogen. So electrons spend more time near oxygen, resulting in a partial negative charge near the oxygen end and a partial positive charge near the hydrogen end. And in this depiction of a water molecule, you can see that the electrons are being pulled toward the oxygen atom. So the fact that it has these slight negative and positive charges at each end or pole makes it a polar molecule. Now, nonpolar molecules are uncharged molecules. They have no partial charges, and this is because the electrons are shared equally between the atoms. So this means that the two atoms are pretty equal in electronegativity. So they're not one of them is pulling electrons stronger than the other. So there's no charge that results. And an example of this is a molecule we already looked at called methane. So here in methane you have one carbon bonded to 4 hydrogens. And carbon and hydrogen have slightly equal electronegativity, so they're not going to pull electrons toward one end of the molecule or toward a particular atom. So there's going to be no charge. It's a neutral molecule. And I'm just going to point out too, you can see that where the hydrogen and the carbon are interacting, there's a pair of electrons, right? The two gray balls. And that's the pair of electrons that's shared in that covalent bond between the carbon and each hydrogen. Okay, so when you put a bunch of water molecules together, they're going to interact with one another via hydrogen bonds. So this is another type of chemical bond that we haven't looked at yet. And hydrogen bonds result from weak attraction between the partial charges in water molecules. So you can see here that the slightly positively charged hydrogen in the water molecule on the right is forming a hydrogen bond with a slightly negative charge on the oxygen on the other water molecule. And so it's a weak interaction, but it's an interaction nonetheless. Now, if you put a bunch of water molecules together, they're going to form a bunch of hydrogen bonds. So one hydrogen bond is really weak, but now you have, in a drop of water, thousands of hydrogen bonds, and that's what holds that drop of water together. So as I told you guys, I'm a big fan of videos. I think they help students learn, and they help put together all this 2D information into an animation that brings it all together. So let's watch this little video of hydrogen bonding between water molecules. So here you have a water molecule, a polar water molecule with a slightly positive charge and a slightly negative charge. And when you put two or more water molecules together, they'll interact via these hydrogen bonds between the negatively charged oxygen and the positively charged hydrogen. And they're weak, which is symbolized by the fact that that interaction forms and breaks easily. But if you put a bunch of water molecules together, these hydrogen bonds are going to actually add up, and 1,000 water molecules that are forming hydrogen bonds with one another are going to actually hold a drop of water together, right? And this is what causes the surface tension of water, the fact that you can put a paper clip on top of water and it'll float. That's because there are enough hydrogen bonds that are forming between the water molecules to hold up the light weight of the paper clip. So the polarity of water, the fact that it has oppositely charged ends, gives it unique properties that are essential for life. So some of these properties are that water is cohesive and adhesive, it's a good solvent, it facilitates chemical reactions, and it moderates temperature. These are just a few of the many amazing properties that are essential for life. Okay, so cohesion is a tendency of water molecules to stick together. And adhesion is a tendency of water molecules to stick to other molecules. So you see this in your lawn on days where there's a mist, and you'll see that there's beads of water stuck to blades of grass. So in this case, cohesion is the stickiness of water molecules to one another, and so they hold together these drops of water. And adhesion is a fact, it explains why these drops of water can defy gravity and float, or not float, but stick to this blade of grass. So the drop of water is small enough that the water contacting the blade of grass can keep it in place, right? And this cohesion and adhesion, it's all about hydrogen bonds. So the fact that water molecules stick together, it's because they're forming hydrogen bonds together. The fact that it sticks to other stuff, like this blade of grass, it's because those water molecules are forming hydrogen bonds with the blade of grass that has slightly positive and negative charges on it. And cohesion of water creates the surface tension that we were talking about a second ago. And you can see in that diagram that the water molecules are forming hydrogen bonds with one another. So many hydrogen bonds will add up to enough strength to support a paper clip, or in this case, a water strider bug. So big whoop, right? Like morning dew and water strider bugs doesn't really seem like it's an essential property of water. But cohesion and adhesion explains capillary action, which is this phenomenon you're looking at here, where if you put a capillary tube, which is just a thin glass tube, water will almost magically make its way up that tube with no energy that you don't have to put in any additional energy. So what's happening there is that the water molecules are sticking to the sides of that glass tube and kind of crawling their way up until gravity prevents them from going further. And this is exactly how water is transported from the roots of trees to the very top of the tree, the leaves at the very top of the tree, right? Think about it. Trees don't have a circulatory system. They don't have a heart that pumps. That's how you transport water and nutrients to every part of your body, but trees don't have that. So actually, they rely on the adhesion and cohesion of water for water to travel all the way up to the very top of the tree and deliver water and nutrients to the leaves. So if it wasn't for the cohesion and adhesion of water, there would be no tall trees. Maybe we would have blades of grass and things like this, but not trees. And trees are the major source of oxygen for our Earth. So this is an example of how the polarity of water gives rise to these properties that are essential for life. Another property that makes water essential for life is that it's a good solvent. So a solvent is simply a substance that dissolves another substance. And a solute would be the substance that dissolves in a solvent. So in this case, we have water and salt. So water would be the solvent and salt would be the solute. And you've done this before, I'm sure. You put salt crystals in water, stir it up, and all of a sudden the salt crystals disappear because they dissolve in water. So an aqueous solution is a substance dissolved in water. So this salt water that results from dissolving salt in water is an aqueous solution. And the cool thing is that water can dissolve more solutes than any other substance. And this is due to water's polar structure. So because of its polarity, because it has slightly negative and positive charges, it can dissolve other polar molecules, other molecules that have charges. So the fact that polar substances are easily dissolved in water make them hydrophilic, which hydrophilic means water loving. Hydro from water and then philic from loving. You guys might know that the Greek word for love is phileo. So it's the same Greek root here that's being used, philic. Phileo means love. And some examples of hydrophilic substances, which are polar substances, are salt, like we just talked about. Sugar also has slightly negative and positive charges. And so these polar molecules can interact with the slight negative and positive charges of water molecules using hydrogen bonds. And water can basically pull apart these salt crystals and sugar crystals and dissolve them. So it's exactly what's happening here with the salt water. So the partial positive charges on hydrogen, the hydrogen of the water molecules, are interacting with the chlorine ion and pulling it up out of pulling it apart from the salt crystal that you put in the water. And then the slight negative charge on oxygen is interacting with the positive sodium ion, and it pulls it apart from this salt crystal. And so eventually that's how salt dissolves, is by being pulled apart by these weak hydrogen bonds. So water can dissolve most substances, but it will not dissolve nonpolar molecules, so molecules that do not have a charge. These nonpolar molecules are hydrophobic. They are water-fearing. Again, hydro means water. Phobic is the same root word we use for phobia, like arachnophobia, which means fear. And some common examples of nonpolar substances are oils, like cooking oil, butter, fats, basically. They are nonpolar. So they will not mix with water. So that's why when you put oil in water, they don't mix. It's because oil does not have charges that can form hydrogen bonds with water. So again, water can't form hydrogen bonds with nonpolar molecules, so it can't break them apart and dissolve them. So you stick a butter in water, it'll never dissolve. In general, think of fats and oils as these nonpolar substances. All right, so big whoop, right? Who cares about the fact that water is a good solvent? Well, the fact that it's a good solvent allows dissolved molecules to come into contact with each other, which then allows chemical reactions to occur. All right, so let's break that down. You are mostly made up of water, right? I think it's 80% or something like that. And that's because cells are mostly made up of water. So the inside of a cell is mostly water. And that's where different compounds and molecules are floating around. And if it weren't for water, these compounds would not be able to bump into each other, come into contact with each other, and therefore there would be no chemical reactions. So there would be no cellular reactions. Your cells wouldn't be able to make energy. They wouldn't be able to, your muscle cells wouldn't be able to move and help your body move, right? So if it wasn't for water, the fact that cells are mostly made up of water, your cells wouldn't be able to perform work. They wouldn't be able to do the chemical reactions they need to do, which ultimately means you would die. Life wouldn't be sustainable. Another important thing about water is that it participates in chemical reactions. So it's part of chemical reactions like photosynthesis, for example. So here you have water and carbon dioxide, H2O and CO2, and those actually are made into sugar and oxygen by this photosynthesis reaction. And sugar here is a C6H12O6, and then you have your oxygen molecule O2. So if it wasn't for water, plants wouldn't be able to do photosynthesis, and there would be no oxygen in the atmosphere available for us human beings to breathe. So again, water is essential for life. And just to break down this chemical reaction for you, a chemical reaction is simply a change in the chemical composition of a compound. So here you have reactants on the left, which are the solutes or the compounds that are being changed. And then on the right, you have the products, which are the resulting compounds of the chemical reaction. Okay, last one. Water can moderate temperature. Doesn't seem like this would be a big deal, but you'd be surprised. So water absorbs heat energy really well. This is why it takes a lot of heat to boil water. It just, and this is because of its hydrogen bonds. So when you're boiling water, a lot of the initial heat that's being absorbed is simply breaking the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules until you break enough of them for water to begin to turn into steam, until water can vaporize, right? So initially heat is absorbed as the hydrogen bonds are disrupted, and then the additional heat eventually raises the temperature of water. And so this actually this is what explains why coastal regions have milder temperatures than landlocked regions. This is why California is a way better place to live than Texas, because it will not get 120 degrees Fahrenheit, because the body of water, the Pacific Ocean there, absorbs a lot of that heat and keeps the coast cooler. Whereas in Texas, we have like White Rock Lake and that's it, right? And we are there's so much heat, it's crazy. Another thing, that's why sweat, which is mostly water, or that's how sweat, which is mostly water, wicks away your body heat and cools your body. It's because it's the heat that your body is emitting is actually being absorbed by those hydrogen bonds and the breaking of those hydrogen bonds. And so that's how your body is cooled. That heat is absorbed by water. All right, and then we'll do one last thing. It's important to touch on pH, because we'll look at pH a few times throughout the semester. So solutions have different amounts of hydrogen ions in them. And you know that a hydrogen ion is a hydrogen atom that's lost an electron. So it's just a proton. So pH is the measure of relative amounts of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, which is simply a negatively charged oxygen and hydrogen, OH. It's almost as if you ripped away a hydrogen from a water molecule, and so you end up with a positive hydrogen ion and a negatively charged hydroxide. So the relative amounts of these hydrogen and hydroxide ions is what we're looking at when we talk about pH. So an acid is a solution that has more hydrogen ions and less OH, less hydroxide ions. So if you look at the scale on the right, the bottom of that is the most acidic pH, and the very top is the most basic pH. And then right dab in the middle is neutral pH, right, which is what water is at. So in acidic substances like battery acid or Coca-Cola or orange juice, there's a lot of hydrogen ions, more hydrogen ions than hydroxide. So these are substances, acids are substances that have a low pH, a low amount of OH relative to hydrogen ions. And a base is the opposite. It has more OH, more hydroxide compared to hydrogen ions. So bleach or drain cleaner, they're going to have high amounts of OH and very little hydrogen ions. And so these are going to have a high pH, a high concentration of hydroxides relative to hydrogen ions. And then neutral is equal hydrogen and hydroxide ions, which is what water's at, pure water is at. So something that is very acidic, that has a lot of hydrogen ions, those hydrogen ions, they want to steal an electron from another atom in order to be neutral, in order to have an electron in that outer shell. And so things that have high hydrogen ion concentrations are going to react really strongly with whatever they touch, which is like why in the movie Alien, the alien blood, which is acidic, it's an acid that can just eat its way through metal or whatever, right? And then and why you can burn yourself with battery acid. And it's this, the same is true with a hydroxide ion. It's negatively charged. It wants to get rid of an electron in order to be neutral, or it wants to steal a hydrogen in order to be neutral, become a water molecule. And so it's actually going to also react strongly with whatever it touches. So bases can actually burn you. Some of the bases we might use in lab, we have to be careful because they can burn. So if the pH in a cell, within a cell, strays too far to one extreme or the other, it can kill the cell. So organisms are constantly working to maintain their specific pH constant. And you might remember this is homeostasis, right? So even bacteria are they use up energy in order to maintain a constant pH so that they don't die. Because if the pH is too low, right, or if it's the inside of the cell is too acidic, then the hydrogen ions can interact with things in the cell and just mess things up and eventually kill it. So all organisms, from bacteria to humans, we try and maintain a constant pH. All right, and we'll end up with this question. So what type of chemical bond shown in this diagram causes different water molecules to be attracted to one another? Covalent bonds, ionic bonds, double bonds, or hydrogen bonds? So now you should know that those are hydrogen bonds. It's not covalent bonds because these water molecules are not sharing electrons. They're not ionic bonds because there's not a transfer of electrons. A double bond is just a type of covalent bond, so it's not that. We're looking at a hydrogen bond. Okay, one more actually. Psych. This is the last question. So which property ultimately contributes to the high surface tension of water? Hydrogen bonding, polar covalent bonds, cohesion, polar covalent bonds and cohesion, or all of the choices are correct? Ultimately, it's hydrogen bonds, hydrogen bonding. That's what allows it to be a good solvent. That's what lets it moderate temperature or absorb heat really well. That's what lets it participate in chemical reactions and what gives it cohesion and adhesion. It's because it can form hydrogen bonds. All right, so hope you learned a lot. Make sure to do the reading on your textbook, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. Bye. Oh, and make sure you complete our online homework assignment for Chapter 1 that's due tonight. All right, have a great one. Bye.